everyone, and thank you for joining us for this week's TXF TV broadcast. I'm very excited for what we have in store for you over the next 30 minutes to an hour. Today we'll be discussing the topic of the future of the climate economy, and I'm very pleased to be joined by two very experienced and knowledgeable people in this subject matter. So we have Mr. Tom Dunn, the chairman of supply chain finance provider Orbian, and we also have Mr. Peter McKillop, the founder of Climate and Capital Media. So Tom and Peter are doing a live interview today on the topic of the climate economy, and they very kindly agreed to stick around at the end to do a live Q&A. So if you do have any questions for Tom or Peter off the back of their interview, please do submit them via the chat function. So without further ado, I will hand the floor over to Tom and Peter for their interview, and they can introduce themselves further. So Tom, over to you. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks, Henry. So I think many of you know me already. I'm Tom Dunn, the chairman and CEO of Orbian, and it's a real thrill for me today to have to be joined by Peter McKillop. Peter and I go back a little further probably than we each need to remind each other, back to Tokyo back in the end of the 90s. But Peter, it's a real thrill to have you to have this chat with you today. But before we get started kind of talking about the new economy and everything else, tell me a little bit about Climate and Capital, how that's come about, Sure. What you've been up to since we left each other in Tokyo 15 years or so ago. So.
Sure. Well, great to see you, Tom. And it's interesting that there's been a convergence of both our paths around the ESG and climate and sustainability. And I think that's a very, very accurate reflection of kind of this change. Well, so what happened was I was at BlackRock for the last, up until about a year and a half ago, and really working very closely on kind of their ESG funds. And I decided at that point that things were really starting to change, and I can get into the mega trends in a second. And so going back to my old journalism days, thinking about the finance and capital, we decided that this was no longer a topic that was of interest to people who were either activists or scientists. So that the world of money and capital and business was really starting to engage. And what we've seen in the year and a half since I've started the publication is just kind of a quantum increase in the level of activity in that space.
Yeah, I mean, so it's your timing's always been exquisite. You were a journalist for a while at Newsweek, I remember that, and then you jumped into you decided that there was far more money to be made in banking and then in funds management. And now, just when that's kind of, there's a new zeitgeist, and you've jumped over. So, again, just a little bit about on the Climate and Capital. What is Climate and Capital? What's its?
Sure. Yeah. No. You're absolutely. Yeah. I needed the Climate and Capital is a media publication group, I guess you'd call it. And what we do is we focus on the business and finance and kind of culture of climate. And we were very deliberate by using the words climate and capital, because up until that point, and still to this point, we use many words that are very ill-defined: ESG, sustainability, impact. But we really wanted people to understand that what we are looking at is the capital, the money, and not just the money, but the intellectual capital and the climate. And I think the climate is fast becoming the most important issue of our time. So we have about 6 newsletters focused on various topics of climate. I hope everyone can subscribe. And we're just focusing on independent journalism that really tries to look at the trends, the themes, and the people who are really driving this new economy.
Now, as an East Coast-based journalist, publisher, I'm going to guess that you were rather pleased by the outcome on November the 4th, and then the inauguration. I'm going to hazard a guess that the New York Liberal.
Yeah, I guess I kind of was. I want to step back a second and talk about these kind of this convergence of 3 megatrends, and it's probably partly why you're now looking at ESG as well. The first was really this idea that that the climate was something that everyone was starting to engage in, and you had to kind of begin to understand the risk and the opportunity that was involved. The second was this very unusual kind of convergence of the end of, I would call it the end of the shareholder first Milton Friedman world, where all of a sudden some of the largest companies were talking about profit and purpose. So that was another, I think, a megatrend. And then the third is kind of a continuing megatrend around the extraordinary quantum increase in how technology and AI could be used to solve and build new businesses. So those things were all happening before the election. But what you're really seeing, and I think the impact of this new election with Biden and his team, is the re-engagement of the United States, but it's going beyond that. For the first time, you have real climate experts in the White House and across all the various governments. You have what you will see here in the next day or two, an extraordinary attempt to almost put more than $2 trillion into kind of green energy and energy related, fiscal spending in the United States. And I think that this kind of the world that we're seeing, or the government policy that we're seeing that's starting to emerge from Biden, has never been done before. It certainly obviously wasn't under Trump, a climate denialist, but you didn't really see it under Obama. And at that time, there wasn't really this kind of sudden global awareness that it's no longer just about talking or listening, it's about acting. That's why I think I'm very curious to ultimately hear how your business is kind of adapted and kind of changed as well. But that's kind of, I think, happening with almost every business in the world today.
Do you think that the COVID, because obviously the defining event for the last 12 months has been the COVID pandemic that has kind of completely just shaken. Do you think that's, I've got a sense that it has. I did a couple of talks last year with people, including a couple with Hugh Cordy, who's the producer of the David Attenborough series, so kind of a natural historian.
I listened to that. Yeah.
And I've got to think that the pandemic has actually kind of forced us to has actually forced the pace on the agenda around the green economy agenda more broadly, partly because it's made us ever more aware of the power of nature. That these are things that are beyond our ken in many respects, but with the right attention. And I think the what's happening now with the vaccine rollouts shows that when humankind applies its very best intellectual property, capabilities, and capital resources, the greatest challenges can be met and can be addressed. And I think that there has been an element around that. I think there's also been an element of which people have been forced to reassess their modes of behavior and have gone, the climate agenda now really needs to be at the front of how we're thinking about things. And this is not a transitory change driven by SPACs or driven by a Reddit or anything else. This is a fundamental reassessment of how people think about their lives.
Yeah, it's both of them, and are really the first time. A couple of things have happened. One is the enemy now is not some competitor or another nation. It's physics, and it's the idea that we are, like it or not, the Earth is getting warmer. And I think people generally would say that it's happening because we're putting too much carbon in the air. That's unprecedented. That's never happened in the world before. You fought a war, it was over, you rebuilt, and you waited for the next day. The second thing is the global response. Again, I don't think that's ever happened before. You had kind of first attempts at it during World War II, but really the idea that all the world is beginning to kind of respond at the same time and act at the same time in very, very different ways, by the way. But it's those two things make this a highly unusual kind of situation. The third thing is really around kind of how quickly we can adapt. And I think Climate and Capital went from almost nothing to kind of where we are today during the pandemic. And no one thought that you could just, using simple technologies like Zoom, like we're doing now, really build a global business almost overnight. So this kind of convergence, this sense of urgency, which I think was also reinforced under COVID, and this idea that this is really not something that we can ultimately win or lose. We can certainly make our lives better and manage around it, but it's a challenge that isn't simple in the way we traditionally have thought about, overcoming human challenges.
Yeah, no, that's I think that's exactly right, and I think that I do think the pandemic has changed the way that we've thought about things. What we've seen, kind of, from our perspective, is this, again, back to a green agenda with a growing awareness. I mean, Orbian is very narrowly focused. We do supply chain finance. That's what we think about. Everyone in the company thinks about many different other issues, but kind of as far as the organization is concerned, we're thinking about supply chain finance. But what has been the convergence, as you talked about before, between what somebody like Climate and Capital is doing and what Orbian is doing, has really come about from this awareness that, firstly, the carbon footprint, to use that kind of slightly crude term, of a company is approximately 10 to 15% their own footprint and 85 to 90% their supply chain. It's a complete an iceberg is the right analogy. The carbon footprint of any given company that sits, as reported, it sits above the surface, but there is 85% of that entire mass is below the surface in their supply chain. Well, that's where we come into play. What we are all about trying to do is deliver capital, and not just capital in terms of the financing, but in terms of the tools of engagement that allow buyers to engage effectively with their supply chains in order to provide the resources, the liquidity, the capital, the funding that enables supply chains to adjust to the new reality of a very much greater focus around this the climate agenda.
So can you get specific a little bit on how that actually is working? Because it's absolutely true. I'm just curious, day to day, how is this beginning to kind of shape the discussions you're having with your suppliers and with the finance folks?
Yeah. So first of all with the suppliers, the tools become one of buyers being able to use access to the program and the terms available under a program to act, if you like, mainly as carrots, but occasionally as sticks in terms of their suppliers' behavior. So if the suppliers can demonstrate appropriate forms of action, that they have moved to a carbon neutral procurement production base, if they have arranged for recycling and reuse to be ever more important parts of their agenda, all of these things, then the terms of access to the financing of the supply chain finance program get ever more improved for them.
That's really,
they need to be at stake, which is that if you don't do these things, if you don't help us, the buyer, with our agenda, then you know what, we're going to have to start to, before we start to move away from you as a supplier, we may need to make the terms of our supply chain finance program a little bit more onerous for you. But this is really all about positives, because to turn to the financing agenda, that's a hugely important part of this. What are the terms upon which liquidity can actually flow into these programs? There are certain private sector sources by themselves are going to be only a marginal player around that at the moment. A bank that is financing an insurance company, a credit fund that is financing, at the end of the day, there's only so much that they would want to do in terms of providing subsidized financing into this. Unless, and this then becomes the really important part, they're able to access the very substantial subsidies that are available from the public sector around this agenda. And that's the real key. The real key to this is creating supply chain financing arrangements that are eligible for, tick the boxes of, kind of appropriate for some of the very substantially subsidized arrangements, for example, from the European Central Bank, for example, from individual European countries, UK, the government initiatives. And we'll be interested to see under the Biden administration to what extent the US starts to actually channel funds that are available in the first instance to banks and other institutions for their support of investments in and programs around.
And for the banks themselves, the financiers, this is no longer just, hey, I see an opportunity here to kind of, get capital from governments, but isn't it also that they are increasingly under pressure to demonstrate that the investments, the credit they're extending or financing they're extending is somehow understands kind of the growing physical and transition risks of climate, so that they can go back and it's no longer just about we're financing this or we're financing that. We have to do it this way, and we're actually going to put pressure on people like you to make sure that you are living, acknowledging and showing how you're acting on both the two big risks of climate, which are the physical risk, which everyone knows about, containers falling off ships in the middle of the ocean because of a big climate related storm, or transition risk around kind of, is this business going to survive in the next 15 years because of all the stuff that's going on?
Yeah, I think that, I think that you're right there, Peter, to say that, banks in particular are under pressure here, but let's not have too many rose-tinted glasses around this. At the end of the day, banks, like all organized companies, are in the business of making money. And yes, we talk about companies with a purpose, but as the chief executive of Danone, the big French food company, just found sort of his cost, at the end of the day, shareholders are only going to give you so much slack as you position the company as a company with a purpose, if it's not a company with a purpose and profits and dividends and everything else. So, there's the reports out today just talking about the amount of lending to traditional fossil fuel businesses that the banks are doing. And that's completely appropriate. We shouldn't be expecting that JP Morgan or BNP is going to get bullied into not lending to Exxon or not lending to BP or not lending to Shell, because those companies are doing very important businesses. It's not for a bank or for those companies to be, if legislation gets passed, then legislation gets passed. But in the absence of that, banks have to support initiatives. But if they can be tapping subsidies and supports that the government and other public bodies are making available, then so much the better.
Yeah, the interesting thing there when it comes to, and that report by the Rainforest Action Network and a group of coalitions is a good report. People should read it just for kind of the facts that are in there. But the banks are really under, I guess, two types of pressure. One is it's really almost a conflict within the bank itself. I think increasingly the risk management committees are going, we have a real issue here, whether it's transitional risk, meaning stranded assets, or whether it's the actual climate risk of, for example, doing heavy real estate, investing up and down the U.S. East Coast, for example. So they're beginning to the kind of the risk side of the bank is beginning to push back and saying, listen, we've got to really understand, and we've got to understand what our risk position looks like. Obviously, what you're talking about is the kind of on the other side of the bank is absolutely correct, that their banks are going to finance fossil fuel companies into the future. The third kind of element that's happening now is the kind of increasingly effective shareholder action, where you're beginning to see, shareholder proxy to statements that would have gotten 0% in 5 years ago are now up to 26, 25%. And I think though that all these things are happening at once. And I think, as I understand the way banks are working these days, they're beginning to understand the risk of climate, but they're also seeing the opportunity. Yep. And I think that's where, if you are going to be running a supply chain and you're not doing ESG, you're not taking into consideration the risk of climate, you're going to make it's going to be a lot harder, I think, going forward for banks to finance, because this tension between the risk side of the bank and the opportunity side of the bank is only going to get more severe.
Yeah, and I think that you're right, and the ultimately $2 trillion for the US. I mean, that's a great big honey,
staggering,
and we're gonna come into that in just a minute. But I think the other thing is, so we just completed our first ESG report, and again, it's available to everybody that's on this call, and it's downloadable. It's a very good report that we put together based on interviews with our clients, with online polling, and with a lot of ancillary research that we did. And it's very clear that our clients, that are some of the largest companies around the world, and their suppliers, care passionately about this. They all, and it's not just because they think that this is a box they need to tick. It's because they are becoming increasingly cognizant of the issues that they face. And so you see that kind of, it's now very much, and I'm sure as a few people read the report, they'll be wondering, well, were we really in the 10% that tick the box that we don't give consideration to ESG factors? Because that's all it's down to now. 10%, would say that they don't. We kind of wonder, well, what 10% is that? But we'll wait and see. And
just one thing that's interesting there. We did a story recently around boards, and I think it's important whether it's the boards, because I think they reflect the management as well. And one of the big challenges is, up until now, box ticking, putting out a sustainability report, that was kind of okay, and that was fine. The challenge, what you're beginning to hear now is, okay, but our boards in particular, and I guess senior management, executive committees, do they really? How is that translating into kind of quantifiable action? And that's, I think, the big trend you're going to see over the next couple of years is, we've gone through the sustainability report phase, we've gone through the kind of the warm and fuzzy language that you see from the marketing folks, all that. Now it's okay. I want to see kind of how you're executing on these kind of promises that you're making around meeting Paris targets by 2050, for example.
Yeah, which I guess leads to as we just said, $2 trillion in the US alone is a great big honeypot. There's gonna be some bad actors that just can't resist the smell of that honey, and whether they are people that are kind of what I call bluffers, or whether they're greenwashers, or particularly as a journalist, how are you thinking about it?
Yeah. So the way I'm thinking about this is, first of all, it's unprecedented. I mean, we were talking in terms of billions until a year ago. Now we're talking in terms not just of a trillion, talking multiple trillions. I don't even know what trillion means, to be at the end of the day. But you're right, there's two things that I think I worry a little bit about. It's great that we're going to use this kind of traditional fiscal spending to kind of not just get the US out of kind of the economic rebound caused by COVID, but obviously to begin to kind of support industries, so-called green industries. But there's a distorting effect that will absolutely happen. So, for example, a potential unintended consequences, if the entire world is just going completely in on green energy, for example, you might find a situation where there's such a glut that it would create a market crash. So I think we need to be careful about the distorting effects. Now, someone like Larry Fink will tell you, well, there's just too much money not chasing not enough green opportunities. So maybe this is going to help build those green opportunities. But to me, you're absolutely right that you always have unintended consequences around this form of government intervention. And there's going to be a lot of ugly stories of people who have scammed this person or that company. So you can expect that. But I'm actually slightly more concerned about just the kind of how that this extraordinary dose of fiscal spending, not just from the United States, but from all the central banks around the world, how that's going to not just distort the economy in general, but particularly kind of the emerging green economy. It's both a good and a bad, I think.
Yeah. What do you think are going to be the main topics at COP26?
Yeah, so it's going to be this quantifiable data. It's going to be our banks really going from saying there are four, or banks and big fossil are for the Paris Agreement to how they're committing to the Paris Agreement. You're going to see a lot of discussion around disclosure, data disclosure, because the thinking is that when banks if they're more transparent about their loan book, that's going to just by default create kind of much more the kind of change that you're already beginning to see, say when banks are coming back to you and asking you for kind of new terms around kind of ESG related areas. So I think that's one area. The thing that's interesting about COP26, which is the UN climate convention or at the end in Glasgow. By the way, Scotland's almost 100% renewable power, which is pretty exciting. But there are three different approaches. And I think these three approaches are going to be very interesting to see kind of play out in the next 10 to 15 years. There's kind of what I would call the European regulatory approach, which is so-called taxonomy. And even there, you see guys like Mark Carney wondering if the taxonomy is already too strict. The second one, and I would put this in kind of the UK, US is in the same boat, call it the traditional Anglo-Saxon banking view of the world, which is much closer to free markets. Let free markets kind of play it all out and really keep the government at bay. That's interesting. Then the third is just a straight out kind of mercantilist approach that China is approaching, where they're going just for like maximum market share on every element of the green economy that they can get their hands on. All three of those, really reflect kind of the culture of the countries. And you will see it, like you're seeing under Biden, maybe a slight movement towards the European approach. The Europeans might realize that they've gone too far on the regulatory approach, and frankly, the whole world's going to be questioning China, when it comes to kind of the kind of trade practices that they're engaged in. So I think all three of those are going to be at play at COP, and it'll be very, very interesting to watch how this all kind of spins out in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think the intersection between those three very different models at COP in Glasgow is going to be probably the most interesting broad dynamic. There's going to be lots of interesting things at a specific level, but the interplay between those three rather distinct, though obviously intersecting wheels is going to be really good. Well, Peter, it's great to chat.
Yeah.
Henry, do you have any questions?
Thanks, but let me just see if we have any questions. So we don't have anything on the platform for now. If anyone does have any questions, then please submit them. I've got a few myself, which I might pose to you. So I think probably one for you, Tom. I think obviously a lot of the onus at the moment falls heavily on individual companies to sort of look towards their supply chains and try and improve ESG measures. But I don't see much in terms of sort of frameworks and methodologies. And what initiatives are taking place to sort of try and establish some sort of specific frameworks and methodologies, and what more would you like to see in that space to help sort of propel things?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that the answer is you're absolutely right. There's little that's going on within the SCF industry per se around that. The way that we are thinking about it, and the kind of the approach that we're going to take until there is a better approach is to focus on some of the official guidelines that have been set up, for example, by the European Central Bank around, what is it that's going to qualify for, and effectively follow the money. What is it that ticks the box? What is it that gets eligibility for some of the programs that have been created? Let's use that as the right framework to think about. Now we can then, as time goes by, we can use forums like this, forums like COP26, participation there, all different mechanisms for trying to adjust those official guidelines. Say, this should be emphasized more. That's possible. That approach that you've taken up until now is possibly leading to some of the things that Peter just described. Some of the unexpected consequences. You might need to think about how to play around with that a little bit. But I think that again, at the end of the day, this the name of Peter's company is highly appropriate. Climate and capital. We're going to follow the climate agenda, but we need to be pursuing the capital that is supporting that, in order that these don't become somewhat quixotic approaches based around years of wondering what the right formulation should be. If there is a formulation that's been set by the people that have got the money, let's use that at least to start with.
Yeah, brilliant. So obviously, a lot of the onus and heavy lifting will have to be placed on, some of the smaller companies down the supply chains in terms of monitoring, and perhaps maybe they're not so much in a position to undertake these measures. How can buyers work with their supply chain to help with that, and a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to tracking?
Yeah. Well, let me jump in on that one, because we have a great case of how that's working here. I did a story on the former governor of the state of Tennessee, and he's been very involved with the kind of green advocacy work. He has created a company that, in essence, understands exactly what you just talked about. How are these small suppliers supposed to kind of, for example, offer carbon offsets, right? That's a very kind of elaborate and very big, you have to be very large to get into these kind of, power forward contracts, et cetera, et cetera. So he has created, in essence, a pool. So he's going to these smaller firms and buying their carbon offsets, or they're selling them to him. He then bundles them and then goes back to Amazon or Microsoft or some large supplier and says, here are the carbon offsets that are coming from your small and medium-sized companies. So there's a lot of kind of, I would say, creativity, because that will allow the small company to kind of do what it has to do at a scale that's okay for them. And they aren't being forced into kind of structures and models that only a vast corporation like Amazon or Microsoft could handle. So I think you'll see kind of very creative ways going forward to kind of get at those smaller companies that don't have the ability to really have all the infrastructure that the bigger companies have. And yet they're getting the same kind of pressure. And not only are they getting the pressure, but the Amazons of the world are getting their pressure, because they're saying, if your supply chain isn't green, we're just not interested in and we're not going to give you the contracts, that kind of thing.
This is also, this is one of the very interesting, in my mind, one of the really interesting real use cases for the blockchain technologies.
Yeah, that's
this idea that there can be a creation of a immutable record, kind of from source to final use. That strikes me as being a something that can be incredibly powerful, because this can now give people the verification of the supply chain effectiveness of the agenda that they're pursuing, and far better this than the use of the blockchain technology, the such focus at the moment on the blockchain technologies around virtual currencies and the such like, which obviously create all of their own hypocrisies or ironies around environmental footprint. What was it? That the Bitcoin hoard held by Tesla has a carbon footprint equal to 1.8 million diesel cars, which kind of puts in contrast to the avowed agenda of an electric car company and kind of how that is going about. But I think this is really kind of the blockchain technologies can be very powerfully deployed here.
Let me jump in on that. This is not to do with blockchain, but it's a great example of kind of human behavioral change. The way I kind of see it is, think about it when your kids were small and it was the first time they were going into a swimming pool or the ocean, for example. Well, up until this moment, kind of much of the world, business and finance, has been that scared kid looking at the ocean or looking at the pool, but unafraid to jump in, not knowing what's going to happen when he jumps into that pool for the first time. I think there's something very, very similar. And what I'm saying is, finally, I think the world has decided, the finance companies, is to make that plunge into the pool. And they don't know what's going to happen. They're just going to start swimming. And all of a sudden, ideas like you just raised around blockchain technology will suddenly start to make sense. But it's only until you're actually swimming in the water that you're understanding kind of how you're going to use all this new technology and financing to get you going. And I think maybe the most important thing out of COP is this recognition that we all have to just jump in now. We don't know what the answers are going to be. We don't know kind of how it's all going to work out, but we have to do something. And I think that's the big change. And I think it's 30 years too late, but at least that's where we're moving. So to me, we will see answers in ways that we can't even imagine today. And we have, 20 years to sort this out. So it's an incredible, I was talking to my wife this morning. I said, I wish I was 20 years old. I can't, my kids are 18 and 20. I just wish I was in their boots. I just think this is going to be the most extraordinary next 30 years that the Earth has ever seen. And we're either going to get it right or wrong. I'm betting we're getting it right because humans are pretty adaptable. So we'll see.
Very good. Well, Henry, unless anything else has come through on your side, I think that's a great point to wrap this up. And I think that Peter, thanks very much indeed. I think we'll be we might resume this conversation before too long.
That would be great. Tom, who would have thought 20 years ago when we were enjoying the good life in Tokyo, or going at 20 years, that we would all be coming together today on Zoom, talking about ESG and sustainability and the climate. Those were not on the agenda in Tokyo.
But it's a very...
And it was all, back then, it was all creative destruction and shareholders go for it, right? Exactly. Those days are long gone. But anyway, it's exciting and fun, and I hope to join you again because this has been a great conversation.
Super. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Well,
not at all. See you. Bye.